Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today I'm very excited to have on a special guest, and that is Shane Frakes. Shane is a U.S. Air Force active wounded warrior alumni, clairvoyant investigative reporter and researcher, remote viewer, psionic explorer, and psi consultant. So welcome on, Shane.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I've seen you a lot actually on X or Twitter. I've seen a lot of your posts and some of the things you said, and like we were saying before we started recording, a lot of our research and even experiences to some degree track. So yeah, I highly recommend that people check out Shane's X or Twitter feed because you're going to find a lot of interesting things on there. And so yeah, there's so many directions we can go with this conversation, but I think for you being here on Engaging the Phenomenon the first time, it would be good for people to become a little bit familiar with you. So why don't we start a little bit with your background? Um, so, we're talking about UAP,
Okay.
psionics and whatnot. So how did you become exposed to this kind of these like consciousness and UAP to begin with?
Well, about 2020, I started having a UAP experience that continued just daily. I was seeing orbs, sharing them with others. I'd get people their first experiences. I'd travel state to state to do different things, and they would just be there. I didn't understand what they were. Um, at the time, like I said, most of my memories from my childhood are pretty spotty, to say the least. If it wasn't for the fact that I got interested in the phenomenon because of the phenomenon, right? I wouldn't become a researcher. It was
Right.
only when I started researching the topic, started my own podcast. Eventually, I became a contributor to the Roswell Daily Record. And my research kind of flowed along from like crash retrievals, nuts and bolts into consciousness. Without going into this consciousness stuff, if I would never have researched it, I wouldn't remember the memories that I had as a child. I would had no way of knowing what I was experiencing. It's only because of the things that I do now for my job using psi that I can kind of correlate and have some context for the things that they used to do to us in these programs, right? Because as a child, one of the things that happened to me is I was kind of picked up in the GATE program, right? I think that's the way they identify individuals that maybe has a brain to utilize like myself.
And
Go ahead.
just can you explain to people what the GATE program is very briefly?
Yeah, gifted and talented education program. I'm under the impression that it was some kind of subtle CIA initiative to find individuals that have I guess, appropriate brains and genetics to do this kind of disassociative work or do the things that I do in the hypnagogic state. Um, from the gate, what had happened is I remember being tested in all these various tests, and most people talk about it online, testing with, let's say, colors, letters, you know, doing putting blocks together, things along those lines. From there, they moved me into another program, which I spent most of my time alone in, and this is the one that most people aren't aware of that I discuss. We call it MK Ultra, but it's some kind of, they moved on from that program. They obviously didn't close it down. They started some kind of psionic exploitation program. And within this program, one of the things they'd have some of us kids do is they test our psychic abilities. They'd run different tests on us. Example, one of the tests I used to have to do, they'd sit me in a room. I'd be by myself. There'd be cards with colors and symbols on them. They'd be turned over, and I had to flip a card. And when I'd flip the card, there'd be someone there'd be glass in front of me, like, and there's someone on the other side with the table with the same cards, right? So I'd flip the card, and then they'd flip a card, and they'd try to see if we'd match. Now, I don't know what they were testing. Maybe it was precognition. Maybe it was something else, right? But it was trying to see if our cards would line up for me selecting. And it'd just be little things along those lines. I wore a lot of headphones, and I'm going to say that is probably some kind of hemisync technology they were subjecting us to that would cause us to meditate and go into these different states. They would give it, one of the things I also remember is some kind of medication they would give us. We'd get a medicine cup and it would be filled with this liquid, and we would drink that while we are in this place. I was being removed from school during all of this, and so one of my things right now is actively going back, and because a lot of people they want evidence from things like this, but we have to remember, man, we were kids. If people working within these programs now can't get anything, It's going to be hard for us kids. But when we were being removed from school, there's got to be some kind of documentation. So that's what a lot of us are on the hunt for, things along those lines. And when I went back to get my documentation from my school, I was told I'm not authorized to see my school records. So I'm still kind of working on that.
Now, uh, this may have some kind of correlation here. Uh, does your family have a history in the military or anything along those lines?
Yeah, actually, so my great grandfather was a test pilot. I had another great grandfather who was at Nuremberg for the Nazis. He was security. I had another great grandfather who helped design the atomic bomb. He was at Oak Ridge and at Hanford. Let's see. And then I have another grandfather who was actually, he paid out to secret projects. But what's wild is this grandfather, the one that paid out to secret projects, had the same gifts that I have. Um, so later I find his journals. And he was like me at the beginning, right? You don't talk about being able to do the various things that I do without people applying a label to you. So he never told anyone. He wrote it all in his journals. And after he passed, I started going through his journals. He's having out of body experiences. He's having some kind of communication with something and he's just writing it all down. And I was having similar experiences down to like whatever the entities that were showing themselves to us as were choosing the color blue, like blue
Hmm.
NHI for me. And he was receiving I thought what I was reading was Saint Michael showed up for him, but he had a blue sash on him.
Wow. I can't tell you how much the St. Michael thing just keeps popping up here and there, even for me personally, actually, uh, which is yeah. Um, sure, there's no coincidence there. Um, wow. I mean, there's so much to go on here. You mentioned something about genetics before. What is the genetic connection, do you think?
Man, the most I can take a guess here, I think it has something to do with that Rh negative phenotype, right? And maybe because of that running through the human population, the caudate putamen and mitochondria. Maybe they have something to do with it, right? Those individuals, for some reason, have I guess, a better type of connection. And I think it's just hit or miss if you're one of those individuals. While I do think that all humans have the ability to make these connections, I just think it's the luck of the draw on excelling at it, just like you would say math or science or anything like that.
Yeah, and people listening to this are going to be familiar with the caudate putamen research done by Dr. Gary Nolan and Dr. Kate Green. Yeah, and that's the just the hyper connectivity that some of these individuals have in that area of the basal ganglia, which it's postulated that it's connected to intuition. Uh, and Yeah, actually, I wrote probably the first article along with my friend Twitter user Jay on the caudate putamen work with Dr. Gary Nolan. And you also mentioned mitochondria. That's a very interesting uh, note
Yeah.
there. So can you explain that a little bit?
I just think the structure. So I think there's a crystalline structure within our mitochondria that allows us to create these biophoton fields. And that biophoton field has the ability to both interact with natural and man-made electromagnetics, right? And I think that's super important to all of this. We create that biophoton field and it lets us interact. I think my biophoton field is one of the reasons, one of my, I guess, gifts, abilities is clairsentience, right? I can feel energies on parts of my body. I think that's
Yeah, yeah.
probably one of the reasons I can run up to a computer or screen and it's like I can feel everything coming off of it. And then same thing with people. So,
Yeah, and I'm much more that way as well, rather than like visual or other ways. The same kind of kinesthetic connection for me. Is there, so just speaking about the mitochondria in general, is there any way that an individual can augment that,
mm,
or is that just all?
I haven't thought about it. I mean, I
Well,
in
because
my own head.
you hear people talk about like, oh, you can boost your mitochondria by doing X, Y, Z.
Well, I'll say that red light therapy, whenever I do red light therapy, near infrared light, I utilize it when I meditate. And I swear to you, I get a boost. And I'm not the only one. I think Darren's even talked about it. I know that the group that I'm a part of, we all swear by these near infrared lights, right? And I actually, sometimes in my head, I think about things along those lines, right? If our biophoton fields can interact with those kind of electromagnetics, something like a watch, could that boost, like on your wrist, boost your electromagnet, if you designed it properly? Same thing with NIR. If that's doing that little boost, I imagine there's other methods to enhance your field. So I tell people sometimes I'm techno-spiritual. I'm very spiritual, but I do use technology to kind of aid in some of the things that I do.
And I think that's absolutely the best. I mean, if you could get some kind of edge or augmentation, why wouldn't you? I think that that's exactly the kind of way we need to be thinking nowadays. And again, you're talking about biofields and whatnot. And I have a presentation here uh, that I've been working on called Subtle Energy and Non-Human Intelligences, and I got a whole bunch of stuff on that I'm going to be putting in a presentation. So it's funny that you brought that up. Um, Now you talked about early testing or you know even experimentation that you have memories of this kind of stuff going on with Psi and all the gate program. And you mentioned MK Ultra. So just what is the connection to MK Ultra? And then, yeah, let's start there.
Okay. So MK Ultra was an early mind control program the United States government started, right? And it was kind of based on, I think it was the Nazi monarch program. I think that's what it was based on. But during this program, one of the things that they did for to try to get mind control is they used psychedelics. And during the use of the psychedelics, right? Book The Search for the Manchurian Candidate talks about they use these things just willy-nilly on individuals, and in the process, they kind of discovered consciousness. So the likelihood is they probably didn't stop MK Ultra. I had a source tell me once they never stop programs. They hide them better and rename them.
Yeah.
They probably figured out that the way to go was not mind control, that psionics and consciousness was it. And so they probably hit the ground running with that. And I do believe that that kind of morphed into all kinds of different programs, including the one I was in, Secret Space Program, whatever you want to call it, Psionic Exploitation.
Psionic exploitation, right? Okay, so I have a two-pronged thing here. We brought up the term psionics a few times. It's kind of been a buzzword in the last few weeks since the Jake Barber testimony came out. Just can we just quickly define psionics and
Yeah, it's psychic and electronic kind of combined, and it kind of discusses the way individuals such as myself utilize psi abilities and then the ability to test and interact with them through the electronics.
yeah, and I don't, for people who have been paying attention, I've seen you specifically using that terminology well before the Jake Barber stuff came out, which I always found interesting. uh, but I mean, we're inferring to it, but let's just, what is the psionic exploitation program? Just to define it for people.
Well, here's a prime example of something that they were trying to exploit, and I think they figured out. So I believe they have technology that somehow weaponized consciousness. And what I say is, so one of the things I do remember is I'd be in a room and there would be this object. It's a round object. The only way I can describe it, it looked like a clear orb. And they would ask me to look into this thing. And what I can tell you is when I look into it, I'd see the same thing I see on the back of my eyelids. I
Hmm.
get visions. So I think they figured out a way to take the visions that individuals such as myself get and they utilize them in some kind of technology. I mean, that's just me putting stuff together from the way I interacted with them and them asking me to do different things.
Yeah. And, you know, there's been discussions about non-human technology, so-called non-human technology and the interactions of consciousness with that technology. But also in a sense, credit where it's due. Dr. Stephen Greer for many years had talked about technology assisted consciousness and consciousness assisted technology, basically where there's an interface between technology and conscious on both ways. And I think that's a very important subject. And again, it comes down to this whole thing about non-human intelligence, their technology, the interface with technology, especially on their level. Like I would say, even our own technology, we can interface with, right? But that with it seems with non-human intelligence is augmented to a completely different level where it's like much like operationally designed for that. Uh, but again, I'm sorry. Another thing you mentioned, I just want to clear this kind of thing for people. You mentioned the secret space program, and people are going to have a knee-jerk reaction to that based on information that has come out over the last few years. And this is something I have not seen untangled, which I wish was. And even in my own case, when I try to discuss those kind of things, maybe it is or was called a secret space program, but the only way I can find to kind of divide the garbage and disinformation that's been put out there on it, maybe intentionally to muddy the waters because it's so sensitive, is I just call it the classified space program because you know that seems to be the only way. But
I understand.
yeah, so let's clear that for people because so many people they hear that term secret space program and they automatically think of a particular individual with a particular story, and it's not that simple, right? And there is a reality to it. And I even know of a very some and let's just say I'll say somebody that's the name comes up in the Invisible College who is being recruited to such a program and actually had his access denied at one stage or one level. And I believe that's an absolutely true story based on a ton of research. But secret space program, let's clear that for people.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of times we get hung up on the way we use these words like MK Ultra, secret space programs,
Right.
psionic exploitation. I kind of use them interchangeably because I think what's happened is information about these programs has come out. People have attached names to them that may not be their actual names. And then those names become known for certain things, right? So then people are like, well, if he said it's this, and it's got to be BS. I think it's
Right.
important. The program itself is what matters, not the actual name, right? And I'll also say, like, I want people to be skeptical. They don't have to, I'm not expecting them to believe me. I don't get paid to talk about these things. I get why people say about individuals who discuss these things. I talk about them because there's more individuals who've been through them and maybe they'll see this, right? And they'll be like, hey, that's kind of what I went through. And the government needs to be held accountable. It definitely was not cool for a child to be going through some stuff like that. I can't speak for others who talk about these type of programs, but I do believe that if there's ever any paperwork released on UAP at all, these programs are going to be in that paperwork.
I'm sorry. I'm going to ask the obvious question here. What so in relation to all this stuff, what what do you make of what we understand in the public as the Scott Andrews story?
Like, um, so I will say
First,
this.
tell me what the Scott Andrews story is based on the article that's in the public
All
and your
right. So
understanding of it.
Scott Andrews, it's a memoir of an individual who was Navy and Air Force, and his dad gets him some paperwork that shows that he was in some kind of a secret space program as a child, doing the things that I discuss within these programs. I think people should definitely get that book when it comes out because it's going to talk about a lot of the things that I talk about, but probably in more detail and better. And this is one of the things that a lot of us kids have been trying to do, right? Find that paperwork because it's not just him who has it. There's other ways to kind of at least allude to the fact that we were in these programs. This is what we did, that type of thing. But yeah, the Scott Andrews memoir is going to open a lot of people's eyes up. It's targeted individual. You've got psionics, you got NHI, all these things that are all part of the same thing.
Yeah, and are you familiar with the actual person, Scott Andrews?
Yeah,
Is
I
Scott
am.
and Scott Andrews is not his real name. I'm gonna take
I can't
it's a
answer any of
pseudonym.
this.
Yeah.
So we can move
Yeah.
on. Yeah, I can't answer
Yeah,
any of this.
sure.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I'll say this that there's no doubt in my mind that individual went through what he's writing about. And I think that'll be part of catastrophic disclosure when people start realizing, wait, some of these individuals talking about these programs may not have been lying.
I think I mean since I read that article, it's I've been highly anticipating that memoir to come out, and I again, I just Jake Barber coming forward was huge, and his testimony, again, it's almost like the crash retrieval thing is super important, right? But the whole thing about the psionics and that whole part, I'm so grateful that that came out with it because I think that was the real part of the conversation that really pushed us ahead like 20, 30 years in the conversation of what is going on here. And it really speaks to, it's getting closer to the core of it. The technology, of course, and the crash retrieval, all that stuff is super important. And the way in which he describes how those programs work and how he developed his cover and how he, so had it got involved in the retrieval and that whole thing, and then he discovered the psionics aspect. All of that is super important. Uh, but yeah, so Scott Andrews, I'm highly anticipating that memoir. Um, but okay, so wow, there's so many angles we can go from here. But let's discuss. Uh, there were ways in the program. We'll say secret space program, and again, people who want to like kind of poo-poo the secret space program. Again, it's not about the name. Dr. Diana Pasulka has talked about it in different ways. She had, mentioned in her book Encounters, and she talks about Tyler, Tyler Durden, uh, Tyler D. Everybody, everybody knows his name now, uh, and the kind of things that he's involved with. So the whole secret space program thing, I think, whether the name is that or whatever it is, there's a greater reality to it, which you're speaking to, and uh, which Scott Andrews is going to speak to, and that very much correlates with Jake Barber's testimony with the psionics assets and whatnot. But in the programs that you're talking about, how did what other means did they use to get you into altered states of awareness, let's say?
Well, I remember being spun. I don't know what I was being spun on, something, right? To achieve an out-of-body experience. I don't remember have too many memories of how often that happened. Maybe after the first one, you just can do it naturally. Some of the other things, a lot of it was testing things like precognition in different ways, and I can't remember what those cards, are they Zell cards, is what they call them?
Zener
Zenner
cards.
cards, yeah, using things along those lines. Um, or you would do things, well, this is gate, towards the end of gate, where they give us all these blocks and they'd see if we could make something out of them. Not just anything, right? Just see what we made out of these different blocks that they'd give us with these weird shapes. But um, a lot of it was just testing for basic psi stuff. I mean, some of the things, a lot of it had involved, so being in the hypnagogic state, being in a chair, and then so I'd interact with adults who would ask me questions, and then I would just kind of relay either what I was experiencing or seeing, because it's something that I do now, right? When I'm in the hypnagogic state, I'm asleep, but I'm actively, taking part in this whole thing. So I can pull myself in and out. I can listen to people and then talk at the same time while still kind of being in that sleep state. I think a lot of that was training us to get in that state and to actively work in that state.
Yeah. And you mentioned the hypnagogic state. Do you have like me today, right? That we were talking about the program just now and some ways that you would be able to enter that state. So nowadays, when you do this kind of work, what are your means and methods and protocols to get into such states?
Well, one of the things I'm very parasite and fungal cleanse all the time, right? Fasting works good, right? Parasites and fungus cause inflammation in parts of the brain, which rely heavily on intuition. So I keep those out of my body. One of the things I also do is I use HemiSync technology or the gateway tapes, Monroe's. I mean, it's just an excellent tool to get you right into that state. I mean, you practice enough, you don't need it. as much. But I also use near infrared lights. And all of these things kind of help me do what I do naturally, which is really nice, right? So I think most of my time I like to spend it in the hypnagogic state because I can receive telepathy and visions in that state. And I've been practicing kind of trying to work out a system to where I can ask questions and kind of get answers, which is how I do the work that I do with the taskings that I receive.
Yeah, and just as a disclaimer, we're not doctors, I think. So we're not giving medical advice, and but again, all these things, you mentioned fasting, and this is reminiscent of aesthetic practices. This is stuff that's practiced in many different cultures for reaching enlightened states and altered states. So fasting, uh, what kind of fasting are you talking about specifically?
I usually do. So I kind of treat these things like I'm in training. Like if I got a lot going on, then I'll make sure my diet and everything because gut health's super important.
Yes.
But if there's something big coming up, I may fast for 24 to 48 hours just to kind of cleanse myself of all of that. And then when I come back, it's almost like that connection's almost even more HD.
Yeah, and when you say fasting, you're just drinking water for
Yeah,
those?
just
Okay,
water.
just water. And again, you're going to see the same kind of practices that are employed in meditative traditions. Whether, a lot of times if you go on a meditation retreat, even if you do eat, it's a very light diet and or vegetarian and whatnot. So there's a long history of these kind of practices and making your consciousness or making you more sensitive to these conscious, even subtle realities and abilities. So, uh, we've talked a lot about psi, but I want to move on to a little bit about the connection between psionics, and non-human intelligence. So, what is the connection between psionics and non-human intelligence?
Well, I think that I like to look at it like NHI are fluent in consciousness. That's their language, right? I think that humanity has the ability to learn this language. It just feels like everything they do, including the technology, interacts on a basic level with consciousness. So I think knowing consciousness allows you to interact with or know NHI. And I use NHI because, again, I'm spiritual. I call myself a Christian mystic, but because it's such a broad term. I don't know what we're communicating with. I don't know, I can assume, right? And make assumptions. And I think that's important because we all build our own metaphysical framework based on our interactions and experiences. So I use that a lot and it turns people off when you say NHI. But it's funny because if I were to say God, it'd turn the opposite people off and other people would come towards me, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's important that we all approach this with a grain of salt. I get that no one knows what this is, and it's good to be skeptical on these things, but it's silly to pretend that we're some people aren't communicating with something and that consciousness doesn't play a role. It's just silly.
Yeah, and I think that's really getting to the core of this thing. In your experiences, have you interfaced with different types of non-human intelligences or NHI?
Yes. So I've experienced multiple entities, NHI, different various forms. But what's wild is I'll always notice if I call them blue NHI. When they show up, you have a knowing feeling. You have a knowing feeling on a lot of these things that happen to show up, good, bad, or whatever. But I've also interacted with, I feel like they're avatars of long since deceased deities, right? Like Utu, Shamash, a Mesopotamian god, shows up in my hypnagogic state every now and again and explains things to me. And again, this is one of those things that I have to work on, that individuals that do the things I do, discernment and intuition, letting you guide, okay, what's this and what's it mean? Because a lot of the information we get may sometimes be like exactly what we wanted, but a lot of times it's allegorical or symbols, and you've got to figure out where it fits into your life that's coming up. And especially if it's precognition, you'll never know it until that event happens. So it's
Right.
so hard to kind of talk about some of these events. People like,
Yeah.
prove it. I can't prove it until that event happens.
Yeah. And I'll give just like a simple example of that, right? Is where I was doing contact work. I was in a group doing contact work, and this is back in 2011. And we're doing our meditation, and I call them connection sequences with non-human intelligence. But so when I was doing the contact work processes, one thing I just like I could not escape in my meditation, it just kept coming to me was triangle, right? And I kept seeing a triangle or the corners of a triangle, and I'm like, and it was a golden triangle. So I just put it away. I said, okay, I acknowledge that, and I'm just gonna let it go, kind of thing. So we get out into the field maybe 2 hours later, and as soon as we're getting into the circle, there was just this perfect equilateral triangle of these three golden craft, right? In a perfect equal. So like I couldn't have guessed that that's what was going to happen. But after the fact, I was like, holy, crap, that makes complete sense now,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's just a subtle, simple, not too fantastic example of that kind of like, was that precognitive? Was it a communication from NHI letting me know what to look for? It's so hard to draw the line on those things sometimes too. And, it just takes experience, trial and error, and again, research. That's why I'm so glad that Skywatcher is going to be doing the work that they're doing. Dr. Gary Nolan's doing the work that he's doing is because, like, you know, people have been refusing kind of to research this in the public. Meanwhile, in like the classified world, it's been like they've been going, uh, you know, you know, working on it very diligently, as you know, for decades. But now it's just finally making its way out into the public, and I'm looking forward to seeing more research done on that, and maybe we'll have a better understanding of it, and with a better understanding, we're going to be able to work more effectively in those arenas. Uh, but for I mentioned, I asked a little bit about your protocols, uh, but what about specifically like your process or what it may be for initiating contact with non-human intelligence or interacting with non-human intelligence?
So I typically go into meditation. I'll start out with um, gateway tapes or some kind of hemisync, right? And then I'll have my NIR light focused on me. Once I'm getting to my state, the hypnagogic state, I can start feeling all the energies on my body. So I can, if I want to, I can move energies up and down my body whenever all this is going on, right? As this is happening, my clairsentience is also going. But once I clear my mind, what happens is I'll start to receive telepathy, and then I can kind of vocalize what I receive, and then I'll get an answer with my clairsentience on whether that's the right thing or if I didn't hear it correctly, right? So I utilize that, and then on top of that, visions will also come, and then I repeat them out loud, and then I'll get a yes or a no with my sentience, fill in the energies on my body, and that's the process that I use. So I communicate, with ask questions, and sometimes I receive some very pointed answers. Other times I get some allegorical things. I'll say that whoever my guides are, they I can't explain them any other way than being guardians.
Mhm.
That's the only way I can explain it. I mean, they're very matter of fact. I mean, it's not this love and light thing that people would say, but they're guardians and protectors of some kind. When I ask for information, they give me the information that I seem to need or that they think I need, which leads me to the places that I need to. And they tell me things to kind of look out for myself when I shouldn't be doing certain things because it affects me in different ways.
Yeah. Well, in regards to that, now we're talking about kind of like interactions with non-human intelligence in a very like consciousness or psionic aspect. What about, uh, you know, going out into the field and interacting in that way? Have, you know,
I
have
think
you,
so.
I mean, have you been out and, you've done whatever protocols and then maybe something shows up, some kind of anomalous phenomena is there.
Yeah, I've done it on more than one occasion. I think multiple occasions I'll say that, and I've done it professionally before as well.
And Uh, are you able to talk to share an experience from that, or
I
even when you've
can,
done it privately?
yeah, I can do it. I can talk about privately. So an example, Buddy Dale, who didn't live too far from me, and when I lived in Washington State, I think he lived in Pacific Northwest or Washington. He wanted to have his anomalous observer on UFO Twitter so people can follow him. But he wanted his first experience, and seeing how we were close by, I said I can try, but like always, I can't promise. It's not like I got these eyes up on dial up, right? So I said, yeah, let's try this. So it was 4th of July, and we ended up going to the Toppenish Indian Reservation, which actually happens to be a hot spot. Hynek did a field study there. And but it was the 4th of July, so him and I had dinner and we realized, hey man, we're not going to be able to see anything with fireworks going off till who knows when. So we made a plan. We go to bed early, and I was like, hey, let's just do 2:30. We'll wake up, we'll go outside, and we'll see what we can get. So 2:30 rolls around, we both wake up. We As soon as we step out the door, I look up and the orb's just sitting there, and I said, there. And he looks up and he said, where? Then he sees it and he starts videoing it. And ever since then, he's been having his own experiences. That's happened a couple times. And then it's also been a couple times where I've had my camera outside and record myself saying, all right, come right in the viewfinder right now if you're here. And there it shows up right in my camera, right? The orb. Kind of blows my mind that stuff like that happens. But CE5, it's a very valid way to interact with these phenomena. I think the phenomenon's more interested in some of us than we are in it.
Yeah, and there's different aspects to that. Even just like let's say in-field interaction. I think it's fascinating, and you can have say like an anomalous, maybe it's an orb or something in the field, and then you can ask it to do something, and it will respond to your thoughts and your intention. Uh, and that's kind of a great way to get a validation, right? If you
Yeah.
see an object, try to interact, right? And if it
Hmm.
just is an object and it fully stops and then does something else, I mean, it's a little more obvious that there's something going on there. Uh, now, you said you've done this professionally. What does that mean?
Oh, I can't talk about that.
Okay,
I've done, let's just say that human biosensors are real. The United States government knows that that the phenomenon's attracted to individuals in some way, and that there's possible ways of summoning them.
yeah. Um, so you before you mentioned a very interesting topic, which is something I've thought about a lot, and I think you're one of the only people I've seen publicly talk about it, which is this aspect of disassociation in regards to this kind of work. Now, can you explain your perspective on that?
Well, I think there's a reason that, like they talk about trauma and experiencers kind of being going hand in hand. I think that trauma comes, or with that trauma comes disassociation. When it, a lot of the things like when you're entering the hypnagogic state and you're doing these different things, that ability to disassociate is the difference between being able to kind of sit back and watch your dream unfold while you're awake, and also astral projecting and all these other things.
Yeah, and I think that is super important, and that tracks in my own experience as well. That ability to disassociate, like we can say like when you're practicing meditation or a contemplative or meditative path, you're learning how to do that in a healthier kind of way, but also in a way where you can learn how to harness it rather than it being an effect on you. So
Yes.
the meditation practice helps you utilize that ability. So it's not just random or you're just going through kind of some phase or you're just trying to disassociate for like a self-preservation way, but you're actually
Hmm.
utilizing it as an ability to tap into different functions.
Yeah. Actually, I like the way you put that, right? Being able to tap into it. I mean, instead of just reacting with it, that's
Right.
basically, because my first couple experiences were I just disassociated and had an out of body or these things happening. So tapping into it was the next step. So I like that.
Yeah. And I also like the way Jake Barber in one of the interviews he did, he was talking about one of the ways that they use protocols. He was talking about kind of lowering the intellect and heightening the intuition. and that whole process, and then reintroducing intellect into that. And that the process that he describes in a yogic sense, from like some of my background in studying yoga, that sounds exactly how you induce super conscious states. It just it's the
Hmm.
same, it's a different terminology, but it's the same kind of process where you're kind of slowing down the mind and you're heightening your awareness, but then you're reintroducing the higher functions of the mind, we can say, into a super conscious state. So you have the kind of marriage between intuition and intellect to like a super level where it's kind of both and neither, right? It's this new kind of thing. Um, uh, do you have any experience working with Skywatcher?
I can't answer that.
Yeah, kids. What do you have any thoughts on kind of what they're doing and in the sense of what do you think of their work?
I think they're doing outstanding things. I think, man, I've said this for a while that it's probably going to have to be civilian organizations that pick up the slack the government's not, right? They're doing it. The government's very well has these programs, but they're secret. It's only for them. They want to weaponize it. So if the civilian organization were to pick up, let's say, and do a non-sleazy psionic exploitation program, I think great things will happen.
Yeah, again, I've been waiting to see some kind of development like this for years. I mean, since I've really been publicly involved in all this kind of work, I'm super encouraged by what they're doing. That everybody associated with it seems like they're trying to do it for the right reasons, and I really appreciate that they're kind of leading that frontier. So, hats off to Skywatcher for doing the work that they're doing. Um, do you so in again you we talked about your protocols and different methods. When you talk about the red light therapy, how do you practice that? Like what's the basic setup for that?
So there's a couple different ways I've heard people either talk about it or myself done it. So I can have it turned on the near infrared mode and just have my meditated sounds going and then have my eyes closed and kind of be facing it, right? And you can feel the energy and things along those lines, but that light that's hitting your eyes, that red light kind of creates almost like a backdrop to where these visions and things like that can kind of project off of and it makes it that much easier. The another way is I'll go to sleep at night. If I want to really get my lucid dreams going, I'll set the mild method up, which means I go to bed and I'll wake myself up at like 1 or 2 a.m. and then immediately put my sounds back in and go back right to meditate. And what usually happens is your dreams become way more lucid when you're doing these things. And I think galamantine is the name of it. There's another,
Galantamine?
yeah, galantamine. I utilized that a while back. It's a very good method. Just got to be careful with it, right? I'm not a doctor. Research your own stuff, but it actually helps you get some lucidity in your dreaming. So I'll set up the mild method, use that medication if I need to. Don't always need it. Have the lights set on me as I'm going back in that dream state, and it just amplifies everything up. So between the binaural beats, the near infrared light, and if you take, I'm gonna say it again, galantamine,
Galantamine.
galantamine, and if you take that as well, these are all just enhancements for that. That's if I do the lucid dreaming thing. I actually spend most of my time, 3 hours a day, I'll do meditation because I'm pretty good at, you just call it transcendental meditation. I get to that state relatively easy and I can get vision and audio and all these other things from it. So I practice that a lot and that's where I get most of my information.
Yeah, and the last episode we did actually, which was like 2 or 3 days ago, I had Darren King on from Point of Convergence podcast and many other podcasts he's doing. He also talked about the galantamine protocol. And again, yeah, we're not doctors or whatever, uh, but galantamine is one supplement people can use to help induce lucid dreaming.
Mhm.
But it's best paired. You mentioned mild. So what is that? Just for
Um,
people.
the mild method is basically it's a method of, I guess, splitting your sleep up so that when you're waking yourself up when you're in your deepest sleep, so that when you go right back to that, you're in the hypnagogic state automatically, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the things that memories as a child, like I said, I never would have known I was doing the things that I do now
Right.
unless I started doing them now. Like all these memories of me interacting with something in the hypnagogic state. I was actually diagnosed with what people would call night terrors. I don't think they were night terrors. I think a lot of people who have night terrors, they're having lucid dreaming followed by visions on the back of their eyelids. Because when my night terrors would happen, I couldn't go right back to bed because my dreams would still be on the back of my eyelids. Little did I know that that's the visions that I deal with today, right? I think a lot of people probably deal with that. I have no clue they're having psionic experiences.
Yeah. And again, because I mean, the stigma around consciousness in general, in some ways, and psi and psionics, it's funny because in the public, it's kind of very just like, oh, this is kind of like imagination and stuff. But in the secret programs, they very well know research and try to utilize all these capabilities. Just and I need people to understand this the same way that they've created a stigma around the UFO subject and UFOs as a reality, they've probably done just as harshly or even more harshly to psi and psychic phenomenon. That is all intentional because they're trying to study it in secret. And while there's just like, imagine, maybe I shouldn't go too crazy with this, but imagine if every individual on this planet started utilizing their psionic abilities, right? Like we'd probably be in a different world by now, for
Sure.
better or worse, right? I mean, this is just it's part of the human experience, and if we, I mean, I think one of the biggest steps forward in that kind of research, exploration, and experience. I mean, again, a lot of it does happen spontaneously, especially when we're kids, because we're more open, and there's a whole. I mean, that's a whole podcast within itself. The telepathy tapes does a great job of like tapping into that. Um, but also people who are not part of the nonverbal community, let's say, like I think it's across the board with children and individuals spontaneously having those kind of experiences and tapping into it, one thing or another. But just, I mean, half the battle is just acknowledging that it's a reality. And once you take that first step and you can start working on it, like things are just going to start unfolding for you, whether it's remote viewing, whether it's interactions with non-human intelligence or CE5 or human initiated contact events or contact work or psionic summoning, whatever terminology you want to use, that those are all available. And I think it's even a bigger part of the whole disclosure thing than many people realize. And again, that's why I'm so grateful that Jake Barber and all the other witnesses came forward with their testimony because it's really getting more to the core of disclosure is not just like, wow, there's these non-human intelligence and they're visiting us and we have their technology. Like, yeah, that's real. That's important. It's a big part of this, but more so the disclosure about who we are, right? And what we can do.
Yeah.
And maybe even what that says about our past and the and the funny thing about it is when we start unlocking those capabilities, those latent abilities and whatnot, is we're only gonna like quicken or augment the whole disclosure process, right? Because now imagine you have a bunch of psionic individuals now working on disclosure together in an
Yeah.
organized fashion, right?
Yeah. I think
Um,
that'd be pretty catastrophic as well, right? For the world to wake up to the fact that, hey, we're we're probably a hybrid species, and some of those individuals have psionic abilities.
okay, I'm glad you brought that subject up because I did want to go there. So what do you mean by that?
So I think that humanity, there's a lot more to humanity than I guess we're led on to believe, and I think our government knows that. I think was it John Ramirez talks about the human. There's 97. There's a symposium where they discussed the Human Genome Project, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and who knows what they were discussing? But I like to think they probably had an idea that the Rh negative was very alien to the human species because Maybe a crash retrieval, they had a body and they were able to see like, well, that's where it came from.
Yeah.
So I think that it could be something like RH negative, but there's something that's alien to us that allows us to have these kind of connections. And I think our government knows that. And I also think that's one of the reasons they monitor individuals within those bloodlines or whatever. Like they have a, was it um, Rendlesham? They have his record, right? Just probably in a case somewhere. I'm trying to think of his name right now.
John Burroughs?
Yes, Burroughs. So his medical records, things along those lines. There's probably a reason they kept his medical records. There's probably a reason the phenomenon chose to interact with them. I think that my buddy, a couple of my friends' kids, and myself, they probably have records of us in a safe somewhere because of just the luck of genetics.
Yeah. And again, we were talking about a little bit about it earlier, and you mentioned the term again, and again, it's another thing I want to clarify or just bring up and shed light on because I actually did a video on this uh, a while back. It's just a collage I put together called "Targeted Individuals." What is a targeted individual?
So for me, a targeted individual is an individual that is targeted by, it could be a third party, but let's say they're the United States government for some reason. My reason, I like to say this. Um, we call individuals that have experience. Well, wait, let me put it this way. If the phenomenon is interested in you, it's because you're caught at putamen, right? And you're an experiencer. If the government's interested in your caught at putamen, you're a targeted individual. I think both the phenomenon and the United States government are interested in individuals that have the ability to do the things that I do. So I think those individuals become targeted individuals, which is one of the things I think that Scott Andrews' memoir discusses a little bit.
Okay, so you brought up a very interesting angle here and mentioned that the phenomenon is interested in these individuals. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I guess we can kind of argue about it. I think the phenomenon knows that some individuals have a natural connection to them or consciousness, right? So they can communicate, they can, whatever you want to call it. I think our government's known this for a while too. They probably monitor individuals that are in contact with NHI or do the things that I do, even if they weren't in a program.
Yeah, now I just want to bring up something. It's going to be controversial, but it's worth bringing up. What do you make of uh let me make this two questions actually. So first, let's start with abductions. What are your thoughts on abductions
I think
regarding
I
the
do.
phenomenon?
I think they're real. I I, I have no reason to think they're not. Now I'll tell you that I've had one experience. This was a while back. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago. That so I woke up, and it's wild too because it's one of the few that I have memory wise, right? And I woke up, and at the foot of my bed, I see four small grays, and then they're on the bed and they're trying to pull me out of the bed, and then I wake up in my bed, right? So this is the thing with me. I think abductions are very real, but for someone such as myself, I have trouble because that event seemed so real, and I do the hypnagogic state thing a lot, and I can kind of tell the difference when I can pull myself in and out, right? That event, I couldn't, so I don't know exactly what it was and how to explain it. So then I'm left, like all other individuals, trying to justify an experience that I had against with people who don't want to hear it, and that's a hard thing to do. So I do believe that abduction's a thing. If NHI is here now, I don't know why they're doing it. I couldn't begin to tell you that, but I do think they have an interest in humanity, and it just makes sense that they're doing that, right? I think Dan Sherman's book, his mom, they tinkered
Yeah.
with in his belly, right, or in her belly, so to create him. So there's got to be something to it.
And do you think that individuals or people that experience abductions would become targeted individuals?
Yes, I do. I think that shoot, it makes me think of, Above Black, Project Preserve Destiny, right? Does the government know who's being abducted and then keeping track because there's some kind of record?
Yeah, I tried getting in touch with Dan Sherman. I'd love to speak to him. You mentioned Above Black, Dan Sherman's book. I highly recommend everybody take a look at it, whether you're skeptical about it or not. I think it's important information, and you should at least take a look into it. Um, so let's take this a step further, and this is where we're going to get really into pissing people off. Okay, so what do you? We have abductions, potentially targeted individuals because of abductions, and then what people call MILABs, the military abductions, where there's some people that maybe they have an abduction that involves non-human intelligence, and maybe after the fact they become a targeted individual and they experience a military abduction. Now, do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my lab is also a very real phenomenon. It just makes sense to me that individuals that the government wants to keep track of that have these abilities, they probably do, and they may be interacting with them in ways that we don't understand. And I say that because I have a memory that doesn't make sense to me that I basically was in a facility with other military members, and I'm sitting on a table and they're slicing something out of my chest, and I the doctor looks at the nurse hands him some samples or something like, here's the tissue samples you need, right? And they're putting something in or taking something out of my chest. But the thing that confuses me is I have no memory of when they would have got me because I had my current tattoos, and that was I don't know within the last 10 years that this experience happened. And I can't figure out for the life of me how they got me and where they would have taken me to. But it's there. And so I think that that's a way for them to monitor, update, check on people that like me.
Yeah, yeah, and again, there's a lot of stories about that, but I mean, one interesting story is Terry Lovelace's story where there's it just has different underlining uh, telltales of different interactions, not only with the phenomenon but also where he was followed around by black helicopters and whatnot. Just a really important case. U.S. Air Force, right? I mean, there's just a lot of these telltale signs of different things. So, you mentioned before you had experiences with different non-human intelligence, and for me too, just um, in some of my own experience, I had definitely felt that I had interacted with different non-human intelligence, and like you can sense the difference, and I guess it's hard to say. I mean, you kind of just have to experience it to know, but you can differentiate a little bit between different non-human intelligence. But let's just say people are hearing this, people are hearing you, people are hearing me or on engaging the phenomenon, and people see Skywatcher out now doing what they're doing, and they're like, "Wow, this sounds like something I want to get involved with." What would your words be to people that they hear about this kind of thing, this kind of work, and are interested? What would be your words of advice or caution or whatever that may be?
Well, first, I will say caution because this is something that while I do talk about the positive aspects, you and a lot of other people can also verify there are some negativity things that you got to worry about, bringing things back, and not everything's love and light out there. But I do highly recommend everybody at least attempts in meditation. You can't go wrong from that anyway. But using something like Monroe's hemisync technology, binaural beats to kind of get into that meditative state, and look into HICE, CE5, all these other things, because the thing for me is you don't know what your ability is until you attempt to utilize it, right? You never
Yeah.
know if you're able to do the things that I do until you just try to do them. I think that once you reach out to the phenomenon anyway, like high CE5, and I think that kind of brings the phenomenon in your life, and then you kind of, you get to where I'm at, where you see that consciousness, the phenomenon, NHI, it's just all part of the same thing we're all trying to figure out.
Yeah. And do you do you have any let's say I don't want to say this the wrong way, but like is there anything that you do particularly for uh, protection or navigating it? I mean, there's this kind of dichotomy in your attitude, I think, as well as if you if you feel the need for protection, it's kind of like your mindset, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I don't want to say people should just go out there recklessly, but there's also something to be said of just having that conviction and confidence and affirmation of it being our right to do as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's for me, it's important. Look, I get a lot of people get upset about the way I talk about the way I interact with psionics because they're worried about the danger parts and all that. But I like to point out that, man, anything that's worth doing is going to be difficult, scary, right? And pushing the boundaries of things people don't understand. Just protect yourself. And I that can be just as easy as for me, I pray.
Yeah,
A little prayer to Jesus or whatever my prayer just happens to be. But I also don't go in afraid. I
right.
do understand that
Exactly.
there's
Yeah, yeah,
things
yeah.
that can happen, but that fear prevents you from doing things that you'd be amazed that you can do. So I don't go in afraid. And by doing that, I also don't react when things do happen. And there are things that will eventually happen, but it's nothing that you can't fix with some cleansing and prayer of your own, right? There's a reason that Tom DeLonge and them, they discuss the phenomenon in this kind of spiritual aspect. I think the same reason that when I go in, I do spiritual things such as prayer to protect myself.
Yeah. And my friend Darren King from the Point of Convergence, he talks about like spiritual hygiene and if you're going to do this kind of work, contact work, even work with psi, it's good to have your conscience clear and you know you need the same kind of again mindset and protection going into that work because you know if you're talking about the contact with non-human intelligence, also you know psi and things like that, you are going you're going to end up in uncharted territory. So it's just good to have the right mindset and again protection or however you want to go about that. Um, so as far as work with psi, say just aside from contact with non-human intelligence, do you have any specific protocols, or it's pretty much the same as getting into those states?
I think a lot of times, for me, mine was a little bit different than a lot of people. I know a lot of remote viewers, and they do things differently. When I get taskings to somebody wants information, I utilize multiple methods, right? So I'll remote view, but I'll also go into meditative state to see if I can get some answers through visions or telepathy, and then that kind of way. So I think what's important is you build your own protocol and because each of us are gifted in specific ways, and once we learn how to use those gifts as a tool set, that's what's important. So I think, yeah, just start out with meditation, see that takes you, right? Practice with some remote viewing, pick up Ingo Swan's books, McMonagall, any of that type of stuff, kind of get you into it. And then once you start practicing, you'll kind of realize where your gifts are, and you kind of mold your experience and protocol towards that. Like I said, I do mine a different way, but in this group that I work with, there's some talented individuals. I mean, to watch an individual almost replicate a picture that someone's got hidden through remote viewing verbatim, right? Blows. I mean, I do this thing for a living, and people blow my mind with some of the psionic stuff. So I don't see how people, and I know people like to say, prove it. I think it's proven time and time again. There's something anomalous there. Until we start working with it like we are now and training it so it can be more reliable, it won't be. So we got to put it out there, right?
Yeah. What do you mean this group that you work with?
Um, Probably shouldn't have said that. So let
uh,
me just say this. I'm friends with a lot of talented psychics, and we like to help the world by using our psychic abilities.
yeah. Uh, and now I want to shift the conversation a little bit because we're towards the end now. I want to talk a little bit about disclosure. So, before that, based on your interactions, people that you've spoken with, right? Like other experiencers or other psionic assets, maybe even if you've spoken to different whistleblowers that have come forward or are coming forward, what what do you think is the nature of the UFO phenomenon? Or like what do you think it is? I know this is kind of a loaded question, but you know, I'm sure based on this conversation, people want to know, like, oh man, what does Shane think that the UFO phenomenon is? Are we talking about extraterrestrial biological entities? Are we talking about cryptoterrestrials? Are we talking about ultra-terrestrials? Are we talking about angels and demons? What are we
Yeah, I
talking
think all
about?
the above, man. But I think
Yeah,
interdimensional, and I think that it shows up the way we need to see it, and the way, So like it could be angels, demons, fairies. I think it's constantly just reinventing itself. Like now, it's technology for us in this age, right?
yeah,
But I think that it's here. People don't like the way I feel about this. It's just personal. It's here to one of them or something's here to elevate humanity, to show us consciousness is the way.
yeah,
And by, gifting us with some technology and things along those lines. There's probably multiple things here. But yeah, I like to think that something is here trying to say, hey, push us a little bit to where they're at, because until we get there, we can't graduate from these meat suits. That's the only way to progress forward.
yeah,
Consciousness.
yeah. And so, and to get a little bit into the conversation of disclosure, what do you think about, our current situation and controlled disclosure versus catastrophic disclosure?
I think our current situation is very controlled, but I have trouble deciding if it's being controlled by humans or by NHI. I think in the end that non-human intelligence, all of this is being orchestrated by them. Was it slide 9 that talks about the cognitive,
Cognitive
or was
human
it?
interface.
Yeah, the cognitive human interface, right? I think about that sometimes, what that may mean. Is there any way they can be pulling strings by just throwing things in front of us that they know, right? I mean, if consciousness is the key and we are all running on it, they have access to our consciousness at all times.
Yes, and another thing that was on that slide was, talking about how non-human intelligence has the ability to basically influence the thoughts of individuals in power in general. And I'm not trying to take a pessimistic or even paranoid point of view, but as somebody who's had many experiences and interactions, uh, you know, as I have, and again, I think we both have kind of a positive mindset on this, but still there's the factor of like people are concerned about, well, if they're that advanced, they can just be tricking or manipulating us. And this gets a little bit into, uh, how Jim Semivan ends up, his kind of slant on it, which I respect Jim and his perspective, but we have different perspectives in that regard. But so, what do you think of that kind of conversation where, man, they're so advanced that, man, even say myself or you have had some probably wonderful, beautiful experiences. Even you hear Jake Barber is sharing this like profound, life-altering, transformative experience that seemed beautiful. So, what do you make of even people having positive experiences? Well, there's always somebody whispering, "Oh, well, it's a manipulation."
Yeah, there's definitely a trickster element. Now, the hard part for me and for a lot of people, I think, could be, is it the same thing, playing a duality here, or is it multiple things? Because I've run into experiences where I've had that, like, to use what Jim Van says, something at times definitely felt like it was screwing with me, right? That, but then I also wonder, maybe that's to get an end result. Maybe there's a reason that these things that we perceive as negative are happening to get something positive out of us, right? Maybe it's because by putting something in front of us we perceive as negative, instead of stepping left, we step right, and they need us to do that.
Yeah,
So it could be the same thing playing both sides, but it could be also multiple things.
right, right. And I love how you kind of leave it open to the possibility. Just 'cause to some extent we can't truly know just yet, at least. And do you have any kind of final words or words of advice to the audience in general, whether it be, you know, being having interest in disclosure or wanting to participate in disclosure, or the psionic conversation, psionic exploration, or people that they want to engage with the phenomenon, anything along those lines, or just words of wisdom in general from Shane Frakes.
I'd say that, look, if you're really head set on disclosure, add your voice to it, right? But add it in the right way. Don't be one of those toxic individuals. We need skeptics, but we also need individuals that are going to science it, right? And you need both of that. But the problem is right now, it's just back and forth. And until that quiets down, you're not really going to have disclosure. I'll say that psionics to me is disclosure. I think that's a huge part. And until we start talking about it and kind of focusing on what our government has known about psionics and how it parlays into the phenomenon, we won't get true disclosure.
Yeah, and it's been great having you on. I didn't even get to half of the questions I had for you. There's so many things I can talk to you about. I definitely would love to have you on again.
I like
Um,
that.
yeah, I hope to see other people interview you too, just because like I have my own bias and preset
Hmm.
questions, but like there's something really beautiful about when somebody's coming from the interview a little bit more innocent and
Hmm.
in that sense where like their questions are like, oh my God, why didn't I ask that? You know? Because to me, it's like I take it for granted to some extent, right? Like we thing for us is like obvious, so we don't think
Hmm.
to ask those questions, which would be great and better in some sense for the general audience. So I do hope to see you on some other podcasts as well.
All right.
But thank you for your time. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for everything that you're doing. And I really appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate everything you add to the conversation. I look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon.
Thanks for having me, James. This was a great time.
Definitely. Take care.